Hey YouTube, welcome back. Today I've got 13 sweet builds for you. This is right before the launch of 0.9, the multiplayer beta. Some of these might change. You should check the patch notes or maybe the description of this video. However, that said, these are 13 sweet builds that if you play Last Epoch and you haven't played one of these builds, you should, because they're awesome. And something about them is very noteworthy and it puts a smile on my face, and it's the kind of build that I want you to play. This is not a list of League Start builds. This is not a list of new player builds. This is not even a list of the strongest builds. These 13 builds are not one for each mastery. These are hand-selected builds that if you play Last Epoch and you haven't played one of these in the past, you should consider it, because that's how much fun they are and that's how sweet the builds are. The first build on the list is pretty broad. I'm going to call it Death Seal plus Reaper Form. And this is a Lich build. There's all sorts of things that you can do with this. But what I want you to do is play a Lich and have Reaper Form turned on and have Death Seal turned on. And I want you to watch your health go down nice and low and realize how tanky it makes you. These builds get a tremendous amount of damage by speccing Death Seal for Deadlock, which if your health is above 33, it goes to 33%. So when you have Death Seal on, you are tremendously tanky. You get damage reduction, armor, increased damage, more damage. You have additional procs that are shooting off at the same time. You're ramping up damage. I think you even get stun avoidance based on this as well. Everything shy of a literal one-shot, you will leech back in a fraction of a second. When you have Death Seal up, when you're in Reaper form, when your build is well put together, it's going to feel incredible. So even though your life is low, you have tons of effective HP. So if you're interested in playing something in hardcore, for example, these builds basically have 2 health bars and tons of damage reduction built into it before you even start speccing your skills and putting gear on your character. When you pop Reaper form and Death Seal, and then you transplant and you Goomba stomp on top of an enemy and the whole screen explodes, you're going to understand why this build is so sweet. The second build that we have for you here is ShatterStrike plus Decoy. So I'm going to recommend playing this as a bow. Technically, you could play this as a melee character, but what's important is that we're using ShatterStrike, not really for damage. It has a tiny bit of damage, but what we're really doing is stacking up as much flat damage as possible from ShatterStrike. And then every couple seconds, we're going to toss out a decoy that instantly explodes because we're using Kelvae Blasting Agent. So there's a number of cool, unique items that you can use along with this. Some that give you more damage, some that give you more defenses as well. But the important part about this build is just to attack as quickly as possible, stack up those pieces of oil coating from ShatterStrike, and then enable one enormous Kelvae Blasting Agent's fueled decoy. It kind of feels like you're tossing out the holy hand grenade. It blows up the entire screen. It one-shots pretty much everything in the game. I remember playing this build during a weekend tournament and getting to wave 300 or so in the arena. And even at that point, when you walk up to a diamond matron, you're still going to one-shot it with a Kelvae Blasting Agent's decoy hand grenade. It feels so good to play this build. I really enjoy whenever I have the opportunity to play this. You have lots of defense coming in from Glancing Blows and the rest of the Blade Dancer Mastery. You're very mobile. You don't need to be face tanking stuff. You can just like move around, keep kiting, and then throw your grenade. You have a lot of life gain on hit, and you have a ton of small hits in the build as well, which make you very, very tanky unless you're getting literally one shot by something. If you want an even higher damage version of this build, instead of stacking Vitality to get a life total, you could use Morning Frost Boots and really juice up the flat damage as much as possible, because Decoy has something like 600% effectiveness of added damage, so every little bit helps. So the best bow for us to be using with this build is the Dragon Song. You could use something like a Hell Reach if you wanted to, just have as much attack speed as possible, especially if you have 1 or 2 LP on a Hell Reach bow. But a Dragon Song is best for us. We're not scaling the Dragonfire, the proc, unless you're using something like Morning Frost, but for this build that I'm going to link to you, it's just nice and trimmed down. I play in hardcore, so I wanted to link you a hardcore build with as much vitality and as big a life pool as possible. But the Dragon Song having a bunch of attack speed and having that +2 to fire skills feels really good for just grabbing as many of those nodes on the various skill trees as possible. The third build that we have on our list is Javelin plus Lunge using Holy Trail. You may have played a Holy Trail build in the past. Maybe you're using a shield because you wanted as much effective HP as possible. When I played Holy Trail using a shield, when I was actually tossing the Holy Trail, tossing the Javelin, I didn't fall in love with it. I didn't really like it that much. What really made this build tick for me was proccing Javelin off of Lunge, which is only enabled if you're using a spear, using a two-handed spear. So it's a little bit strange because there's not too many two-handed spears that we can use that actually benefit our build. But thankfully, we get to use the Judicator unique two-handed spear to make the most of our weapon and our offhand slot because it's a two-handed weapon. So this build is ridiculously fast. Remember, Holy Trails do overlap and it does double your damage. So instead of just having one Holy Trail up at a time, we can have up to 3 at a time given our cooldowns. So we can toss one, we can lunge, we can volatile reversal back, we can toss another one. It's a very, very mobile playstyle, and it gives you so much play. We have 2 different movement skills that we're using pretty much all the time between lunge and volatile reversal, and we very seldomly need to actually toss the Javelin. This is relevant because in Javelin skill tree, we're going to take a 50% more damage multiplier for 1 point, which gives us minus attack speed. And we're not going to build throwing speed anywhere on our character. We're going to build mana regeneration, we're going to build elemental damage over time, and we're going to build healing effect because remember, that actually gives us our flat adaptive damage for this spell. For our 4th build, we have Smite plus Hammerthrow. I'm going to link you a devotion version of this build, but you don't need the devotion to make everything tick, but it certainly does give you a tremendous amount of damage. So here's the build. This is Smite procced off of a throwing attack. And this specifically makes use of a 2x2 idol, chance to proc Smite on throwing hit. This has been the subject of some nerf conversations in the past. Hopefully this makes it to 0.9. Hopefully it makes it to 1.0 as well, because it's such a fun style of play. It's kind of like Cast on Crit from Path of Exile, if you're into that kind of thing. But you wind up your Blade Vortex worth of hammer throws around you, and then you dash into a pack of enemies. Every individual hit of the hammer throw that procs Smite will also proc 3 lightning bolts. So if it's going to proc it on one and then on a subsequent enemy that's right next to it, it's shotgunning in a way, and it gives you a tremendous amount of clear speed. Using a devotion, my own version of this build has had over 500k damage per Smite on the dummy. So that's a ton of damage, way more than you actually need in the current scenario. Or in the current patch for Last Epoch. But suffice it to say, this is one of the builds that I've played the longest in the game, and just having the hammer spinning around you, lunging into a pack of enemies, and having it's kind of like the closest thing to Herald of Ice that we have in Last Epoch right now. It's a really, really satisfying playstyle. So if you want to juice up the damage, I would recommend going Paladin, using Devotion, doing the mana stacking thing, especially with something like Stormcarved Testament, which is just like chef's kiss on a build like this. If you want to go a different version of this, you might try going a Void Knight as well. But this, with Devotion and the mana stacking, is my preferred version of it. So if you've never done Hammer Throw proccing Smite, I totally recommend it. Our 5th build here is one of the most popular builds in Last Epoch right now, and certainly through the history of Last Epoch as well. It's very visually impressive, not only from your character model, which looks excellent, but also the skills that you're proccing. It's very fast. It has lots of ways to scale both damage and its defense, and it's pretty easy to put together. So this is one of the few builds where I will say, you know, as long as you get the one mandatory unique item for this build, this is a great one for a beginner as well. So this is EQ Werebear. You're going to play a druid, you're going to swap forms into a bear, and you're just going to run around on all fours, periodically blowing up the entire screen with huge crit damage that's echoed 2 times. So this build can be built a variety of ways, but the most important parts about this is that we're using a Baldar's Wrath, which is a pretty common drop from one of the level 90 monoliths. So as long as we have this, we can spec into Werebear form. We can just have our little hop, our maul, and that will proc our Baldar's Wrath as well. If you haven't already played this build and you haven't felt how much offense and defense you can get from such low investment, I want you to try it. This is a great benchmark for other builds in Last Epoch. So when you're saying like, is this thing broken? Is this thing too strong? Is it too easy to put together? This is the quintessential too easy to put together. So it's a good thing to have in your back pocket that you can compare other things to. Build number 6 on our list of sweet builds is actually one of the most popular builds that just popped up when I first started playing Last Epoch. It was popularized by one Lizard_IRL. You might know this guy if you're in the Last Epoch community. But he started playing something with BowMage. That was the name of it. It was using a newly released unique bow at the time, Reign of Winter. That's a fairly common drop from one of the level 90 monolith bosses. So this build seeks to proc Reign of Winter as often as possible. It's going to use huge crit damage, crit vulnerability to make sure that we don't actually need to build critical strike chance, and shoot a bunch of icicles. BowMage is one of the most iconic builds in all of Last Epoch, in my opinion. Even if you don't play this game, even if you've only watched a video or seen a couple seconds of a stream at some point, you might still know what BowMage is. It's very visually impressive. It kind of reminds you of a cast on crit Ice Spear build from Path of Exile. It has a lot going for it. It's got huge damage numbers, and it has a very nice playstyle as well. So the build that I'm linking to you here comes from Lizard IRL. This is Reign of Winter. We are going to juice up the damage of the Icicle proc by stacking as much dexterity as possible and using Morning Frost boots. Whenever I put this build together, because I play in hardcore, I try not to use Morning Frost, and I just rely on just my good old-fashioned normal crit damage. But really, if you want this build to pop off, you should be building with Morning Frost to get damage on the bow and the icicles at the same time, and then you're just scaling one stat as hard as you can. With the introduction of LP items and the legendary system, getting attack speed on your Reign of Winter, or getting movement speed, hybrid life, health, physical resistance, cold resistance, getting anything like that on your Morning Frost makes the gearing process a lot better, even in hardcore. So this build pops off super hard. It's very easy to put together with just the Reign of Winter and the Morning Frost build. And again, to me, this is one of the most iconic builds in the game. And if you haven't played it, it should be on your list of builds to try at some point. Coming in at number 7 on our list that has no particular order to it of sweet Last Epoch builds is Static Orb. So this is Static Orb plus Lightning Blast. You can use Lightning Blast as a mana refund mechanic. You can use Lightning Blast as a single target or to augment your clear. There's a number of ways that you could build this if you wanted to. But what I recommend to you is playing Static Orb, not the Orbit variation, because the Orbit variation has been nerfed and I don't think it's very good anymore. But play Static Orb, play crit, and spec into the Scatter Blast nodes, which means that you're firing 4 additional smaller orbs. When you're building this as crit, it's lightning damage, which means that it benefits from all sorts of critical strike multiplier with lightning skills that the Sorc has access to. It also means that you're going to stack shocks very, very quickly with the 4 additional small orbs and the fact that Static Orb hits multiple times. So you shred lightning resistance very quickly because you're going to build Lightning Shred. You shred lightning resistance very quickly because you're going to have shock chance on your skill. And you're going to have huge crit damage as well. When I play this build, I feel like I'm launching a nuclear bomb every time that I shoot a Static Orb into a pack of enemies. It deals a tremendous amount of damage, even at a relatively low level, and it's a very easy build to put together. When I play Static Orb, I feel like I've got a smile on my face all the time, and that's the kind of thing that I want you to experience with this build as well. So if you haven't played Static Orb, put it on your to-do list. Our 8th sweet build that I want you to try at some point. So this is a rogue that is specialized into Blade Dancer. Umbral Blades is the most realistic way to build this character, just because Umbral Blades is very, very strong. But having a build like a Blade Dancer here that procs most of your damage off of shift means that you have a super fast playstyle. You're probably going to have enough damage even if you don't spec into a single target, just because Umbral Blades is so strong. Whether you're going for a poison build, which is, something that you're going to self-cast more often, or going for my recommendation here, which is a Shadow Dagger build. So the build that you'll see linked in the description of this video is using a Smoke Weaver, trying to get our cooldown for shift as fast as possible. You'll see cooldown recovery speed on the helmet as well. If you want to go ham, you can dual wield your Smoke Reavers as well. Your shift will be a little bit shorter distance, but you'll be able to shift much more often. So I like playing in hardcore, which is why I have a shield here. But listen, I know hardcore is the minority. You don't need to use a shield in your Blade Dancer. I understand. A couple key things here to understand are Larakas giving us throwing a critical strike multiplier. Shadow Daggers are a melee and throwing skill that's procced off of having enough Shadow Daggers there. Suffice it to say, when you're building melee leech does apply. When you're building throwing critical strike multiplier, that applies as well. Shadow Daggers scale very well off of flat damage, so having things like throwing physical damage on your ring, or even the cursed prefix of throwing physical damage or throwing fire damage along with increased fire damage taken, even this is an excellent way of juicing up your Shadow Dagger stuff. So suffice to say, if you've never played a build that procs the majority of its damage off of shift and just having Shadow Cascade, throwing daggers, or having Umbral Blades come off of one of the shadows behind you, this is an awesome playstyle that makes it very, very fast. And just because of how strong Shadow Daggers are, you could even scale that fast playstyle into something that's going to, basically one-shot bosses at 200, 300 corruption. It feels very fun to play. Build number 9 is actually the very first build on this list that I haven't played personally. So maybe I should take my own advice and just play this build sometime, because apparently it's awesome. I've had multiple people tell me that the Necro Skeleton Mage's Sacrifice is a really, really good build. And for the people who commiserate with me, saying that they don't really like playing minion builds, maybe they don't really like playing Necromancer builds, that this build is one of their favorites, and it's probably their go-to for any time that they have to play a Necromancer build. So this build has been described to me as most of your minions are actually explosive projectiles. It's very tanky, it gains busted zombie ward generation without having to actually cast the zombies. It's a fast build, it's good for mapping, it's good for bosses. It has a lot of explosions, so it's very visually impressive, which I think matters a lot for being on a list like this. And then you get to cast some wraiths as well for single target, even though you're not using them the majority of the time. So this build, I was curious about whether it actually belongs on the list. I pushed back pretty hard, because if I haven't played it, do I really want to put it on the list of builds that I recommend to you? And it's been recommended pretty hard. So I'm going to try this build at some point. It's the one build on this list that I haven't tried myself, but apparently it's sweet. Apparently it's really fun. So maybe you and I should both try this out. This next build is number 10 on our list, but it's probably number 1 on the list of things that you should double check your patch notes for 0.9 or even for 1.0. This is a build that is enabled by an unintended interaction, but it's cool as hell. So I wanted to include it on this list anyways. This is Surge plus Static. So Static was recently given a node that says it gains extra flat damage per static charge that it has with its discharge, but it costs an additional 1 flat mana per static charge that you have built up for the discharge. So what happens with this build is when you're using Surge, you get to bypass the additional mana cost, and you also get to bypass the cooldown. So it's unclear to me which of those, or maybe neither, or maybe both of those, should be happening in the build. Should it be bypassing the cooldown of Static's discharge? I don't know. Should it be bypassing the mana cost? Maybe, but who's to say? So this is the most skeptical build for the future. If you're playing pre 0.9, this build is intact, and it's incredibly fun to play. It's also very tanky, because I'm linking you something that gets to make use of the mind over matter mechanic, the damage taken from mana before health. If you want more information on this, I've got a YouTube video on it too. It's awesome. If you're watching this video after 0.9 or even after 1.0 release of Last Epoch, maybe Static plus Surge has been nerfed. So here's the stand-in for you. Instead of playing this particular build, I'm going to say that build number 10 that I want you to play is something using Fractured Crown. I want you to experience a build that makes use of damage taken from mana before health and also uses endurance threshold stacking instead of hybrid health, percent health. And the reason that I want to include this build, even though it's bugged and maybe it gets nerfed in the future, is that it uses Fractured Crown, and it's such a unique way of building a character. Basically, in Last Epoch right now, we are in a health meta. you build hybrid health wherever you can, you build percent health wherever you can, and you're probably building flat health wherever you can as well, assuming that you have enough resistances and endurance and stuff like that in other places. So when you're playing a Fractured Crown build that has the damage taken from mana before health, you want as little life as possible, so about 1,000, maybe 950, and you want as much endurance threshold as possible, because that endurance threshold kicks in before the damage is taken from mana before health, and then that mechanic, the Mind Over Mana mechanic, has additional damage reduction built into it. Partnering that with something like Mana Strike, or maybe even something like Glacier that has a mana refund mechanic on it, turns your character into just this, one of the tankiest things you can actually do in Last Epoch. If you combine that with +1 Flame Ward charge and having 3 Flame Wards at any given point in time, turns you into just like, if you're paying attention, it's going to be very hard for you to lie. The build is extraordinarily tanky. Coming in at number 11 is a build that I like so much, and I actually stopped recommending it to people. Very often I have people come to me either in Discord or on Twitch chat and say, hey, I'm playing Devouring Orb, but I'm kind of bored of it. And it just breaks my heart every time that people say that, because like, I get it. You're numlocking things. The build is too high damage. It's too automated. It kills everything on the screen. You can spec it to have Abyssal Orbs that give you even more coverage that makes it better for map clear, or you can spec it without Abyssal Orbs that makes it even better for higher tier content because you can just spec into more damage multipliers. Devouring Orb, I like the skill so much. I wish that I could recommend it in good conscience, but I feel like when I recommend it to somebody, it just ends up getting them bored and they're looking for their next build sooner because it just does everything so easily with so little investment. Frankly, if you've never played Devouring Orb, you should. And the reason for that is you should know what you're up against, right? When people say that gear doesn't matter if you're talking to Lizard IRL, or if you hear people say that the endgame progression ends at level 70 or ends at 75 or ends at 80 and there's no reason to get more gear, you can get more gear, but there's a reason that some of those conversations come up in the Last Epoch community from time to time. And Devouring Orb is one of those reasons. You have a tremendous amount of damage. You scale very, very well with the base damage, the mechanics of the skill, the coverage, the overlapping like AoE stuff. It's a really easy character to build and play and gear offensively and defensively at the same time by stacking up vitality. If you've never gone through the process of building this character, you should, so that you have a baseline for other things. For me personally, I love Devouring Orb. I think it's really fun. I think it's really pretty. I love watching purple explosions. But the real reason to play this build is that you should know how much power is available if you're playing one of these meta skills. Build number 12, our second to last build here, comes straight from Amarathy, who played a ton of Frostbite ShatterStrike when it was first available with the Frostbite gauntlets, and then later on as well with the Snowdrift boots. This build is on the list because it has some unique stuff going on, and it's also, again, very visually impressive. This build is very fast. Even after the nerf to Hummingbee, you have access to more movement speed than your average build does. You have lots of ward. 100,000 ward is not an unrealistic thing to get with this build, especially when you have so much attack speed available to you. You can freeze literally everything, not only the things in front of you, but you'll be proccing some icicles as well. And this is a great example of how much CC you have available when you're actually building into freeze as a mechanic, instead of just having it as some extra thing that's tossed in as an afterthought. The mechanics of ShatterStrike, if you've never played it, it has like a melee recast built into it. And it's one of those things that I kind of wish was in more action RPGs, because the melee recast from ShatterStrike, they don't lock you in place like Multi-Strike does in Path of Exile, for example. But it's just you attack once and they continue to happen even though your character can walk around. So you have some extra mobility while you are stacking up your Frostbite, you're freezing enemies, you're going to continue moving. And why should you play this build? In the words of Amarathy himself, gotta go fast. The last build that I'm going to show you for this list of sweet builds in Last Epoch is actually a brainchild of a couple people who were talking in Twitch chat, and I think it started out as a meme, but it turned out super well. So the footage that you'll see going on is me playing a two-handed bleed Forge Guard Shield Rush build. But the build that I'm going to link to you is actually from Dread, from Epoch Builds, and it's a one-handed build, Shield Rush, Bleed, Paladin instead, making use of the Holy Aura proc in order to apply additional bleeds on top of what you would normally have. This build probably got the most pushback from people in Twitch chat while I was putting together this list of sweet builds that I think every Last Epoch gamer should play. But this build is cool as hell. If you've actually never played Shield Rush with no cooldown as a DPS skill, your Shield Rush has no cooldown, which means that it doesn't share a cooldown with Lunge, and you also get to use Volatile Reversal to its full effect because you're a damage over time build. You have 3 movement skills in this build. You make very good use of Wings of Argentus because you're never actually stopping. You have very good Leech coming in from Bleed and from a Bleeding Heart and from Valdir's Chalice to make up for the life that you're spending by casting Shield Rush over and over. This build feels like you're a human pinball, and it's probably the most underrated of all the builds on this list. But if you're a Last Epoch gamer and you haven't played this build before, it is so much fun. I have found myself having a big smile on my face every single time. And frankly, that's probably the most qualifying factor for every build on this list. It's cool as hell. It makes you want to talk about Last Epoch more, and it makes you want to share this build with somebody else. So there you have it. Those are 13 builds. And again, this is not a new player league start list. This is not a list of the strongest builds in Last Epoch. This is not even a list of one for each mastery, and you can try these builds out. This is a list of builds that I think are the most fun builds in Last Epoch. It's biased toward me because there's only one Primalist build, and I struggled to find out more Primalist builds that I think are worthy of this list. And there are strong builds, there are good builds, there are mechanically builds that I would be willing to play during a weekend tournament if I'm trying to get in first place. But I don't think that cuts it. I don't think being a strong build or being easy to put together, I don't think that's what this list is about. This list is about if you play Last Epoch and you haven't tried one of these things in the past, you should, because they're fun and they make you want to play more Last Epoch. Some of these builds are iconic, the kinds of things that you might even recognize if you're not a Last Epoch player, but maybe you just watched a video or a stream or two and you saw something going on the screen, even if you didn't necessarily know what was going on. That's what this list is. And if you haven't tried any of these 13 builds, check the description. All the planners will be there for you. And I hope that you enjoy it.